Hey, we're going to let folks trickle in just a little bit. We're going live tonight on a lot of different platforms, and some of y'all are probably listening to this recording afterwards. But every month we do a book club at Red Letter Christians, and tonight is extra special because we've got Katelyn Beaty, and her book is Celebrities for Jesus. And that subtitle is really great, Katelyn, so I should read it. How personas, platforms, and prophets are hurting the church. So I'm going to do a little official intro in a minute, but I don't want anybody to miss that. So as folks kind of continue to join in, we got some folks on the Zoom machine here, and I think you can use the chat, y'all. We're going to keep your cameras and stuff off for a second, so the recording is kind of easy to follow and everything. But there's a few things on the horizon. We're doing our monthly morning prayer, so that's around the corner on May 1st at 9 o'clock in the morning. Folks kind of around the globe join for prayer on the first day of each month. And we got a really special guest this month. It is Dr. Vanetta West from the King Center, and she is just incredible. She'll be our prayer partner, but we'll also talk with her for a half hour or so. There's a lot of other stuff that we've been doing. I mean, gosh, a lot's happening in our country. So we've been down in Nashville this month. We've got some executions, sadly, that are lined up this month. So please keep track of everything happening. There's a little piece of our website where you can take action, because we are people of prayer, but also people of action. And tonight, I've been reading this book, Katelyn. It's just so wonderful. And I'm going to I want you to tell us why you decided to write it in a second. But for y'all that don't know Katelyn, she's been a friend for a while. She's actually helped publish a lot of the books that we've used in book club. She's the editorial director for Brazos Publishing House, and that's one of the many hats that she wears. But they're putting out a lot of really good books, and I don't just say that because they published one of mine, but there's a lot of great friends that have published there, a lot of Red Letter Christian authors there. And so Katelyn's very transparent. We're going to talk about that too, about some of the ways that the publishing industry contributes to this kind of persona and celebrity that is not helpful to this for the sake of the gospel. But Katelyn is also doing a podcast with a religion news service, Saved by the City. She is out there doing all kinds of really great writing and journalism, award-winning writer. I've seen you in documentaries. You're all over the place. But this new book this is what I wanted to start with, Katelyn, you're acquiring all these books. You've got a really good pulse of the topics that have already been covered, and maybe the kind of like little holes that haven't. And so that's why I'm interested. I mean, you could write about anything. You're the acquisitions editor. So like, how did this book choose you? Like, why did this come up as the fire in your bones at this moment?
Yeah. Well, as a journalist, I'm not supposed to have a lot of fire. I'm supposed to be objective and clear-minded, but yeah, I have been in the Christian evangelical American world my whole life and my whole career. I was an editor at Christianity Today magazine for almost a decade. And while I worked at CT, our staff received, several tips and allegations about famous pastors, authors, people whose books were on my family shelf growing up. I mean, people whose work I was very familiar with. And these were serious allegations. We had to report on them and just started to wonder. I mean, of course, on one level, you just feel so discouraged. Like, how is it the case that somebody whose persona and public image seems really integrated and healthy and whole, like, how is it that this person can also do such, damaging things behind the scenes? What is the disconnect? Mm-hmm. But also, spanning out beyond those particular stories, asking, is there something in the water in the American church where we are inclined to put people on pedestals without offering accountability that actually sets people up to fail? Is there something in us that is looking for celebrities in our midst that wants our leaders to be celebrities of sorts?
Yeah,
and so this is very much not just it's those people over there and their problem. It's like, this is an us problem. And I think for all of us who are really tired of seeing these discouraging headlines, it feels like every week, every month, there's a new headline coming out. How do we get to some of the systemic and attitudinal, even spiritual issues at the root level so that we can try to prevent as much as possible seeing more of these headlines?
Right on. And I think before we dive into the material, I've got all my highlights and little tabs and things that I have as I read it. But you're very forthcoming about your own backdrop and all of this. And by the way, we share some of the same music. The Newsboys and even the Acquire the Fire. I mean, a lot of y'all listen to this, you have no idea what we're talking about, so just hang in there. But even Jeff Moore in the Distance, I was like, that's one of my first CDs as I went from cassette tape to CD. So like we grew up in that subculture, but give people a little bit more backdrop because it also like is related to the material, like you kind of write about that in the book. But, how you found Jesus and how you kind of spit out the bones of some of that evangelicalism that you grew up with, but and it kind of gets you to the point of writing this book. But I mean, you obviously can't do it all, but give us a little bit more about your spiritual journey, because that's also what we're trying to do at Red Letter Christians, right? Is trying to like sing a better song than some of the really toxic versions that of our faith, that are out there. So
yeah. Well, I'm a Midwesterner through and through that happens to be living in New York City. So I'm a little bit of a fish out of water, very aware of how expensive things are here. And I would say grew up in a nominally Christian home. We moved around a lot because of my dad's career. And then in my early teens, I think maybe like a lot of people who are tuning in, I was very much part of the 90s, early 2000s youth group culture. Our family started attending a United Methodist Church that I would say was seeker sensitive. That was the terminology. Great worship music, simple, clear preaching, very evangelistic, and was kind of tapping into this broader national evangelical subculture of musicians, pastors, best-selling authors. And so I came to faith in that. You mentioned Jeff Moore in the Distance. I made a decision for Christ at age 13 after a Jeff Moore in the Distance concert, responded to a very simple gospel presentation. And, we could critique all sorts of cultural trappings of that, but I definitely think of that as a very genuine commitment to Jesus that has borne fruit. Our church was, I would say, a mega church hopeful. I don't think we ever technically got to the mega church level, but like we really wanted to be big. I think growth and thinking of, the excitement of the Christian life was to see growth, to see numerical growth. I would say more an emphasis on numerical growth than kind of a deeply formed spiritual formation oriented type of growth.
Yeah.
But certainly, like the models I had for Christians doing big things for God were all Christians with some kind of platform. They were famous people. I didn't know them personally, but they were kind of held up as models of what it looked like to do big things for God. And I think that spoke to a kind of evangelical impulse of fixating more on individuals than institutions. I mean, of course, I was part of a church, but the energy of my everyday faith was more about looking to these individuals out there doing big things from a stage or, later from a screen than what was going on in the local church community.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about the mega church, I think, because you talk about Willow Creek and several of these other like very large Hillsong, some of the bigger, mega churches that have had pastors that have kind of fallen from grace or had some major abuse, not just allegations, but things that they've done that but I think as you begin to kind of identify the problem, like early on in your book, you sort of differentiate between fame and celebrity, and you talk about celebrity. I thought it was really helpful as social power without proximity or without relationship. So say a
Mhm.
little bit more about kind of how you define celebrity and how you
Mhm.
distinguish it from influence or from power.
Right, right. Yeah, well, I start out early on in the book by saying it is not wrong to be famous. It's not wrong to have people kind of far and wide. If you're a writer like I am, I write in order to communicate, to change the hearts and minds of people out there. Now, my goal, I hope, my motive is to share good work in the world that is helpful to people and
Mhm.
uses the tools of media to reach people. So just because someone has a following or people recognize their face or their name, that doesn't tell us a whole lot about the motives at work. Whereas celebrity is something very modern. There have always been famous people in every time and place, but celebrity really is 19th, 20th, 21st century phenomenon because it relies on the tools of mass media to project an image that's impressive, that draws people, that's charismatic. Oftentimes what's being presented is more a persona or personality rather than the work itself.
Mhm.
And people, with celebrity dynamics, people will attach to you a certain kind of superstardom. They look to you to embody their values, or they have these expectations of you that are beyond what most humans can bear. And
Yeah.
what is, I think, especially, tricky and dangerous for celebrity in the church is that celebrity requires the kind of the distance of the stage and the screen. And we forget that we don't actually know. I think to really know someone, it means spending time with them in person, in embodied relationship and community over time, to know someone's character, to know, who they are. And we
Yeah.
forget with celebrity that I have an impression of them, maybe I like them, whatever, but like, I don't actually know this person. And I think in
Yeah.
that distance comes all sorts of problems, because so often it means lack of accountability. People don't actually really know the celebrity figure until, it's too late. And then we realize, oh, because we didn't have accountability, this person was leading a double life and was abusing their power. They were abusing their secret, the ability to keep things secret. And then it
Yeah.
affects this whole community or institution.
Yeah, we'll get into some of that because I think that, you're distinguishing between privacy and secrecy and icons versus idols. You have a lot of these like kind of ways that you show that the idea of having influence isn't really the problem. It's when you lose relationship and intimacy and transparency and accountability in the midst of that. And I mean, one of the people you kind of talk about, you can see some of the seeds of this growing around Billy Graham, right? Who's often one of the kind of superstars of evangelicalism. And yet you said in your book that you quite like Billy Graham, and I quite like Billy Graham as well because he led my wife to the sweet Lord Jesus. She found the Lord at a Billy Graham crusade, and we've done a fair amount of gentle critiques of Billy Graham, and how he might have been a little bit more present in the civil rights movement and things like that. Anyway, but I think that
Yes.
I mean, folks are really hard on him for having this rule that he
Mhm.
wouldn't be alone with women, but he also did other things. One of the things you talk about is the transparency that he had with finances, which I think a
Right.
whole lot of I mean, the church would be healthier if every church, big and small, every pastor,
Mhm.
much less every televangelist and author was transparent with their finances. So I don't know if you
Mhm.
want to say a little bit more of that, because it seems like Billy Graham rides the line pretty fine between
Mhm.
an icon versus an idol, or
Right.
an influencer versus a celebrity. I mean, he actually, I
Yeah.
think, in his own life is kind of trying to figure that out and made a few mistakes that
Right.
he even recognized himself as he looked in the mirror. So do you want to say
Right.
anything more about that? I mean, as Billy Graham, or kind of how this then begins to evolve. And we're going to talk about social media, and where we're at now is absolutely miles away from the Billy Graham crusades. But I thought it was
Right.
helpful to
Right.
kind of track some of the roots of this back to
Yeah.
Billy Graham.
Right. Right. Yeah, well, like you said, Shane, I like Billy Graham, and not without caveats. And Graham had his own caveats about his own life looking back, especially his involvement in politics, overly close alignment with several very troubling presidents who ended up using him. His lack of involvement in the civil rights movement, trying to kind of stay neutrally out of the picture, which we understand you can't really be neutral on issues of racial justice. I do think of Graham as a kind of quintessential evangelical celebrity. I mean, he's arguably, maybe aside from the Pope, the most famous Christian of the last 100 years, maybe at least, yeah, in North America, but he's also known the world over. And he is really such a model evangelical celebrity because he had such a pragmatic embrace of mass media. I mean, starting with newspapers before he and his team would come to a city to do a crusade. He was using the newspapers to get the word out. Very early adopter of radio programs, television. I'm sure many people here remember seeing an old crusade on their grandparents' television. Many people might have even come to faith because they caught a crusade clip. So he really embraced mass media, without any kind of reservation. He said, I can reach more people in my lifetime using these tools than Jesus did. Now, it's a pretty bold thing to compare yourself to Jesus and to come out the better one in the comparison. But he wanted to reach as many people as possible with the gospel.
Yeah. And
I think,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think early on, you mentioned the Billy Graham rule. I'm not a fan of the Billy Graham rule. I don't think it translates well to 21st century workplace environments. Graham, was working in a time when women weren't as much in the workplace and positions of leadership. So there is a cultural context. But to his credit, this agreement that he made with some of his closest colleagues early on, right as his star was rising, he's very young, he's attractive, he's charismatic. He realizes, oh, I have this power over people. People flock to hear me because I really am an incredible communicator, and this could go really badly.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I could use this for selfish and destructive purposes. And I could be distracted I could really let the fame itself be the reason I'm out here rather than the gospel. So here are these limits. And as you said, commitment to financial transparency, commitment to always work with the local church. He didn't want the crusades kind of outshine the work that churches were doing in particular cities. His salary would always be set by a board so that there wasn't this pressure to give at a crusade. He didn't want to use emotionalism to kind of coerce people to give more money. So yeah, for all the things we could say, I think he at least rightly understood the temptations that would come with celebrity and was trying early on to create barriers against it, to create
that's a good way to
accountability.
say it. That's a good way to say it. He was very aware of the dangers that came along with it. And I mean, if we had a little bit more of that, I think there's other evangelists like Ravi Zacharias that might have used a little bit more of the Billy Graham rule, that the fact that, and in our community, it's not about gender as much as it's not necessarily healthy to be alone with people that you don't know really well, and especially when we're working with people that have been abused, folks that are victims of sex trafficking, coming off of active addiction, things like that. So we've always kind of looked at Jesus sending the disciples out in pairs as just a general wise rule, let's do life together, and we've had plenty of people that are from outside of our neighborhood that come in and are, maybe have vulnerabilities of telling a story in a way that's not accurate or kind of exploiting what we do. So we're pretty cautious with that to try to have, community be a grounding point for all these different relationships that we're intertwined with. So I'm with you. I think that there's probably some good critique of some of the things that Billy Graham did, but there's a lot of wisdom in some of the things that he uh, like, just guide rails that to keep it from running off the road. But
Right.
so I wanted to talk a little bit. I mean, so we've come a long way from Billy Graham. I mean, now like you mentioned this in your book, social media has created, I mean, an all new reality to celebrity. Some of it you've kind of you talk about the way that social media has democratized the celebrity pipeline. So, there's a rise in narcissism, there's a drop in empathy, it's kind of like everybody is at least a wannabe celebrity or influencer, and it's such a weird thing. But one of the things that was interesting, so I want to talk about social media and how it's kind of further complicated this celebrity culture. But one of the things you talk about is that the amount of faces and people that we're bombarded with. You said that, we have contact with more humans than any previous generation, because we're just, and this is one thing I wanted to say, Katelyn, is that I heard a neuro scientists talk about how we have like 1,000 face recognitions that the average mind can do, and this really helped me have a little grace with myself, because I've not recognized people when I probably should have. But he said, well, what happens is you just your brain begins to, like, if you haven't seen someone in a few years, they go kind of in a back folder, and other people that may not have as deep a relationship, but you're seeing them every day, they just kind of are in your front burner. And so it kind of gives you, well, we all have about a capacity for about 1,000 people. But then as I'm reading your book, I'm like, but what if like 500 of those people are celebrities, right? That are just TV and like people that I'm wasting my brain space with people I don't even know, right? And so now I can only recognize 500 people I do know. So anyway, I wanted you to say more about this idea that we're bombarded with more more humans than we can have relationship with, and that's part of the problem, right?
Yeah, man, I was not aware that there was a limit on the number of faces you could remember. So that's very sobering anytime I'm tempted to like look up celebrity news or scroll Instagram, like, am I so fascinated by these people out there who I'm told are important or who I need to know about, that I'm actually disconnected from or distracted from the people in my embodied life and community. And I think that is a real temptation, both on the consumer side. How am I spending my time and attention? Where are my affections? But also, why is it that I know more factoids about this particular celebrity than literally the people who live in my apartment building? Isn't that a little bit weird? But also, if you are on social media and, maybe you have a message or you have work you want to share, whatever, how is the platform itself fostering celebrity dynamics within you? So that is something that, I mean, very ironically, as I'm launching a book last summer about that's critiquing celebrity, my publisher and I are also hoping that I will share about the book on social media, that I will hopefully
get a few blurbs on the back from names people recognize, right? Yeah.
Right. Like, I recognize that I am, because of the nature of book publishing and the consumer marketplace realities of how books are sold, I'm participating in a subculture that I'm pretty uncomfortable with. Thinking back to the first few weeks of the book being out, and this should be a time of celebration, and wow, you've done all this work, you want to share it with people in hopes that it helps people and helps the church get healthier. And then I'm meanwhile like checking my Instagram feed to see if people liked, it is pervasive and pernicious, and it requires, if you are on social media, a real a deep kind of desire to do the inner work to keep your motives pure. And maybe even going back to Graham, maybe it's accountability. Maybe it's, every weekend, my family members and my community members, we agree to turn off our phones for a full day. Maybe it's time commitments. Like, I'm only spending this much time on these platforms. I just think that the platforms feed something in us that is longing for validation, longing for attention, that sometimes we become what other people want us to be. And I think if you are a leader and you have a prophetic message, recognizing sometimes you're going to have something to say that everybody wants to hear, that isn't going to make you the most popular on these platforms.
Yeah,
So
it's good.
Using the platforms in a way that is integrated with your vocational call and whatever prophetic work you're doing, so that you don't just become what people want to hear and see.
Yeah, great. And so just in case folks are tuning in or listening to the recording, we're talking with Katelyn Beaty, who wrote the book that we're talking about tonight, is Celebrities for Jesus. And one of the things you talk about in here is that the medium does not just transmit the message, but it changes the message. So there's this, this point where you're talking about the medium itself, and some people like Billy Graham said they want to, I want to preach to more people than Jesus. I think of our friend, who's one of the most humble people I know, but presiding Bishop Michael Curry of the Episcopal Church. His sermon at the royal wedding had like 1 billion people listen to it. It's the most listened to sermon in history, and thank God it was a really beautiful one. It was about love and humility, and so but I think that you're onto something when you're talking about when our goal is to reach as many people as possible. This happens in the mega church too. I'd experienced it at Willow Creek, where it's like things become 1 mile long and 1 inch deep. There's less depth to our spirituality. It's less about discipleship and more about sound bites and things. So how dig a little bit deeper on that, like how you feel like this idea of just reaching the biggest message with the biggest microphone, how does it actually change the message and not just transmit it?
Yeah, well, there are a couple different parts of that question. There's the emphasis on numbers, which, as Americans in a capitalistic society, we're taught from a very early age. We want our businesses, our organizations, our churches, we want things to grow in building size, budget, and number of people in the seats, right? That growth is the goal and the sign that we're doing something right. I think about how growth can feel like blessing. And I get it. We all want some kind of tangible markers that the work that we do matters. If you do have an evangelistic heart or part of a ministry where you're trying to reach people, of course part of you wants to reach as many people as possible. And then these tools of media come along and say, we can amplify this by 1,000. We can help you reach so many more people than you ever could on your own, face to face. So I get the impulse. I also think we are in a time, or I wonder if we're in a time when enough Americans in the church and outside the church are saying something about this numerical only emphasis is creating bad fruit. That is over fixated on profit, that is over fixated on numbers, but not on people as sheep, as people to be cared for. Caring for people takes time. It's inefficient. It doesn't always fit our program. And the megachurch has done, a lot of work in reaching people. But I wonder if there's a generation now that's like, I don't want to attend this church anymore because what I'm hearing week in and week out is not taking me deeper into the life of Christian faith. It's, as you said, Shane, it's sound bites. It's things that play really well as a social media clip, but don't actually draw me into deep embedded community, which is where I think the Christian tradition would say that is where the transformation happens. It's in person, it's with people, it's life together. And gosh, that's a hard sell for a lot of us in the United States, because people are hard and complicated and messy, and life together is hard and complicated and messy. And sometimes it feels better to pop into church and pop out and get your felt needs met. So some of this, of course, isn't just about people who are leading mega churches and how they measure growth. It's about us. It's about a consumer felt need approach to our spiritual lives. we want things to be comfortable and easy, and it can be a hard sell to call people into community with, real people who are deeply flawed and annoy us sometimes.
And some of this we are exporting. Like, I mean, there's obviously like a Christian industrial complex in the United States, but we've also sort of spread that around the world. And I mean, I remember being in Rwanda, and it's like Joyce Meyer owned like an entire television channel, like not show, but like,
wow.
like that, and so there's millions of folks that know some of these celebrity folks, which is
right.
also why it's so devastating when someone like, evangelist Ravi Zacharias, has this terrible abuse record, and everybody finds out like after he's already passed away or whatever, So talk a little bit though about like this dynamic of, this was really interesting in your book. You talk about the power of the individual is more than the power of the institutions. And I think this is something that's like at play in our culture right now outside the church as well, is where like you sort of think of some of our more charismatic political figures that are more powerful than the Congress itself,
right.
Sometimes they have a disproportionate amount of power for good or for bad. But you kind of point that out in the church, that what began to happen is that individuals eclipsed, is the word that you use, the institutions that they started, and the institutions end up serving the individuals rather than the individuals. And then when these individuals do something, sometimes a minor error, sometimes it's downright abuse of someone, then like the fallout, the collateral damage is massive, right?
Yeah. I mean, you just you just summarized what's really at stake. So as you said, there's a decline in trust of institutions at all levels of American life, everywhere from politics to our educational system to academia, these places where traditionally 50, 75 years ago in American life, people felt like they could, I'll just take like news media as an example. Most Americans they tuned into the same 3 nightly news channels. And there was great trust that what they were hearing was verified and corroborated and true. And we all had this kind of shared narrative, not all Americans, but a majority of Americans. The conversation now about disinformation and which media outlet can you trust, it shows this breakdown in a kind of common journalistic institutions that people kind of turn to and put their faith in. Now we're all more inclined actually to get our news from like individual reporters and people we follow on social media who we really like. And yeah, I do that too. But I think it speaks to the ways that individuals, especially individuals who are charismatic, who look good on screen, who are great speakers. I think that's a really key element of this when we're thinking about the church and Christian organizations. The power of the oratory event is central, and actually evangelicals have understood that to be kind of the central event at church. The sermon from the one person is the main event. I certainly grew up with that understanding that the sermon was the main event. And so what ends up happening in a lot of institutions, as you said, is that over time, the individual leader is more trusted than the institution itself. More, using Willow Creek as an example, it's been really hard for Willow Creek to disentangle its institutional life and identity from the identity of Bill Hybels. Bill Hybels was the visionary founding pastor for decades. A lot of people at the church were at the church because they really liked Bill and they really trusted Bill. And this is not an argument to say we should never trust our leaders, but it is to say we need both individual and institutional trust and forms of accountability. It's when the individual has this outsized power over the institution that you see such collateral damage when the individual falls. Because how many of them, even knew Willow Creek apart from Bill Hybels. It's virtually indistinguishable.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's a lot at stake for churches and organizations trying to, put the pieces together after scandal and failure.
Yeah, and I want us to talk just a little bit about like how this, I mean, this is a human problem, but it is also a Christian problem, right? Like this is in the church, but I mean, you think about some of the ways that celebrities have abused their power. Harvey Weinstein, you mentioned, like Bill Cosby, Jeffrey Epstein, the reality TV star president that we had who literally said stars can do whatever they want, and like justified his assault of women. Like, so like um, but then you kind of feel like there's a little bit different bar. You would hope the church would act a little differently, like, and that we wouldn't sort of give in to this narcissism of like individual person. And you, yet, like in your book, one of the things that you say is that it's only kind of gotten worse. I mean, we think of like, you said the sense of losing power of the church kind of struggling to reach the next generation. A lot of churches shrinking, the Southern Baptist being total disarray. Like there's actually the opposite effect where there's this clinging to the strong man, like the idea that we need a Justin Bieber or we need someone to validate our faith to the general public. So there's almost this like exactly what we don't need, but there's this kind of like clinging to that idolatry, like I'm going to say more about that because I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, I think you're right that we look at other realms of society and we think many white Christians in America feel beleaguered, or they fear losing power. They fear they're being kept out of the public square. And gosh, all these other realms of society, they have their strong men. They have their people who can go on television or social media or whatever and say something confident and gather millions to rallies. And we need, instead of questioning whether that desire to rally around a central figure to give that person a kind of ultimate or allegiance or loyalty is good or bad, or is in fact idolatrous, we say we want that too. Like we want the person we can rally around who's going to stand up for the faith in the public square. So I think you see this, I arguably Mark Driscoll at least was a celebrity who gathered a lot of attention and following because he was this brash, masculine, arrogant, like it was like he embodied all the kind of worst elements of American imperialistic masculinity. And he was also, ostensibly talking about Jesus. We'll take that, at Hillsong, global church network that has been in massive crisis for the last several years. Several of its pastors were almost essentially hired to be celebrities and to befriend Justin Bieber or the Kardashians, to befriend actual Hollywood celebrities, almost to give the church a kind of cultural validation. Like if we're the kind of church that can attract Justin Bieber or Kim Kardashian or whatever, then we know that we have this cultural power, this cultural credibility. And sure, that's not the point. The point is to draw people to Jesus. But how, at some point, if you're so fixated on celebrity and cool church, doesn't that become the point? It's very ends justify the means thinking. And I think it does come down to a real a lack of confidence in God to preserve the people of God in the next generation, in the coming generations.
You getting to preaching now. We're gonna keep leaning into that. But I gotta say, like, it is amazing how resilient some of this stuff is. Like to where, I mean, literally, you think there's no way that Mark Driscoll can come back, and then my gosh, like the Terminator, there he is. And now Sean Foyt, like literally is amplifying like this stuff, And I mean, I sent Sean a message when he went to interview Ted Nugent. I'm like, this is an unapologetic white supremacist, these are the people that you're aligning with. And so there's this problem, right? That it does so much damage to the gospel. So we're going to talk about that. But I think part of it too is you talked about this is one of your lines. You said, the problem with ministering to the 1% is that once you're among the 1%, it can be hard to stay in touch with the 99%. That's like almost the exact opposite of Jesus, right? Like, does not go to the centers of power, to like all of the rich folks. I mean, they lean in, some of them, to Jesus, but he's on the margins. He's born in brown skin, Palestine, with as a refugee, homeless in a manger. Like, every way is putting this the center on the margins. And and I've been a big critic of Young Life, even though I loved it when I was in high school, because of the key kid philosophy, right? If you reach the cheerleaders and the football team and the quarterback, then you'll get the whole high school, and there's so many problems with that philosophy, right? And they've rethought that. They've apologized and said, we're doing it differently. But this is still what a lot of the church does, right? They're like, if we can reach the celebrities, if we can reach if Justin Bieber will just show up for worship, then the whole world will come to its knees. And there is a form of idolatry in it. So I want us to talk about the better faith, because you really get there. You don't just spend the whole book analyzing the problem, but you really offer some solutions. I mean, starting with relationship again, one of the things that you said, that the more you know about people, the less you know them. And I think of Michael Jackson, was so lonely, it felt like. I didn't know him, but he seemed so lonely. Chris Farley, I love was these lives. Prince, so many of these celebrities, they end up it almost feels like there's such a loneliness because there's a lack of real relationships and friendships. Everybody knows about them, but not many people know them. And so you kind of bring us full circle back to the relationships and love. We're made to know and to be known, to love and be loved, and nothing virtual and narcissistic, nothing can replace that, right? This is the heart of the gospel.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I had no idea that was a strategy of Young Life. I knew that it was for popular kids, but I didn't realize it was an actual strategy.
Yeah, so that's even a name for it. Key kid philosophy. Yeah.
Whew, I was not in Young Life because I was a band geek. I asked a mentor of mine who's written about celebrity power in the church, as I was writing this book, because honestly, Shane, most of the book is me trying to assess and diagnose a problem. And truthfully, I don't think the celebrity problem is going away. There's part of me that hopes that maybe we're starting to see some turning, but this has just been such an area of the American church that has mimicked the world instead of critiqued it. And I do think, at the end of the day, it does come down to cultural power and seeking power, seeking to be at the center rather than seeking to be at the margins. And I don't know how much of the church is willing to give up power, but when I asked him, this mentor, where do we go? What is the solution? And he said friendship, which just seems so friendship. Well, yeah, of course, friendship is great. But if you think about, people in your life who know the great things about you and the not great things about you, and have journeyed with you for years and have been with you in the times where you were at your height of glory and success, and maybe times when you felt deep failure and depression and loneliness. And if those people can show up and keep showing up out of this sense of commitment to you, to your good and flourishing, gosh, if I have 5 people in my life like that, by the time I'm, 65, 75, I will feel very my life has been very rich. And I think what can
I
happen.
mean, you said it really well. You said those are the people that nothing can impress them and nothing can shock them.
Right,
And you said
right,
you don't need another fan, you need another friend. You need a friend.
right,
And,
right.
yeah.
And I think, going back to the psychological and spiritual toll of celebrity, I do think that over time, it can just be the case that you find people, your relationships start to become transactional. People
Yeah.
turn to you because of something that they want a piece of your power. They want something from you. They want to be around your power. When you look at celebrity pastor dynamics, and they maybe have an accountability structure in the church, they have an elder board or board of directors or whatever, but then when you dig into the real like interpersonal dynamics of the board, you realize, oh, these are this guy's like yes men. Here, these people want their own, they want to be celebrity pastors themselves, or they're hitching their own sense of glory or Christian success onto this person. So how can you say a hard word to the pastor when you feel like you might have something to lose once their power diminishes,
Yeah.
So I really do think that some of this is about making sure that people, including and especially people with platforms, can find places where they can really show up as themselves and be deeply known and deeply loved. But then I just also think some of this is getting back to a vision of ordinary faithfulness, not seeking to live out a faith among the 1%, but being content with a kind of Christian witness that is not about making a splash. It's not about growing, but it is about creating deep transformation in the communities where we live and move and have our being. And that can be very unglamorous work. Like it may not be posted on social media. It may not seem to have a big effect, but I really think that those seeds of faithfulness and care are kind of what hold the world together. People who faithfully, quietly serve and are content with that, they hold a lot of our lives together and we don't even realize it.
Yeah, there were a lot of things I thought of as I was reading, especially the tail end of the book, where you kind of invite us to, think beyond this celebrity culture. And I thought of well, there's a great Small is Beautiful. You ever read that book? There's a great project on that. But this idea, Dorothy Day, who's a real inspiration for me, she was a very big critic of the big and I mean, in every way, like government. She was, kind of a Catholic anarchist, and she said our goal is not to get bigger and bigger, but smaller and smaller. And a lot of the images that she pointed to of Jesus are things you can't even see. Light in the darkness, and leaven. Yeast, and the mustard seed, which was kind of an invasive plant, and so this idea that we're to live in contagious but small ways, beautiful ways in the world. And I thought of Jesus. You point this out kind of in the book. You sort of wink at it that Jesus had like a dozen friends, and he might have had a lot of fans and a lot of enemies, but he only had a handful of really close friends, and some of those didn't even end great. I mean, one betrayed him, one denied him, one took his own life. I mean, some of these stories were tragic, like they were imperfect relationships too. Even though he was the embodiment of perfection and love, like the people he was around, like they didn't love him perfectly, but here he is modeling like this intimate community that everything came out of that. So it was like, if Jesus did that, like if Jesus lived intimately in these little towns he went to, like Bethany and Capernaum, like that we read the capital nouns of the gospels, like these were little bitty towns. Like Capernaum had 400 families in it or something. It helps me like remember that this is a gospel that's grounded in real relationships, and the God that is so big and beyond our imagination, in some ways, like puts on flesh, takes on a name, puts skin on. And that's part of the point, right? Is that like actually God is very human, it gives us the way to model our lives after, right? And it's a total subversion and rejection of power, right? I mean, from birth to death and resurrection, right? Yeah.
Right. I mean, I even think about the fact that Jesus, didn't enter public ministry until he was 30. And we might think today, like, oh man, what a waste. Like he could, with his mass, he was God. He knew all things. He could have been so much more effective and efficient. But, God in Christ spent most of his life in relative obscurity. Like what do we even make of that? And I read a little bit about, Jesus's temptation in the wilderness and a kind of refusal. Henry Nouwen writes really beautifully about, basically Jesus refuses to be relevant, spectacular, and I forget the third
powerful.
one, but
exactly.
Powerful, but we can understand these three temptations basically as Satan offering like the kingdom of the world, this kind of worldly power. And Jesus might think, oh, I could use godly thing, I could use these means to accomplish godly purposes. But we know that the way you do things, how you go about things, even good things, really matters. And Jesus is saying, I'm not going to play by the rules of the world to accomplish my mission and purpose on earth. Like my purpose and mission is to obey the Father. And that might very well mean in one real sense, it meant facing death by being crucified by the Roman Empire. So if this is how God reveals himself to humanity, like who are we to expect that we could accomplish godly things by just following the way the world thinks of success and accomplishment?
So good. Well, this hour flew by, and I'm going to have to say that I hope you all will read the other stuff that Katelyn's doing too. Is just wonderful, and we're going to try to do all we can to stay get more of Katelyn Beaty at Red Letter Christians. But Celebrities for Jesus, this is the book we've been talking about. If you haven't picked it up, check it out. And any closing thoughts that we didn't get to that you want? And then I've got a lovely benediction that I learned from one of my celebrity friends that I'll tell you about in just a second. But I want to give you the closing word, Katelyn, as a wonderful non-celebrity, ordinary Christian writer and spokesperson. So thank you so much for joining me. Anything you want to close this with?
I don't think so. I guess thank you for allowing me to get fiery. That's not that's not my modus operandi, but sometimes when I'm talking about this stuff, it comes out. But I just really appreciate you hosting this conversation, and I hope that it's been helpful to the people who have tuned in tonight.
Yeah, so good. This is so good. I may still have so many questions. Just thinking about all this terrible undermining of democracy and things happening in Nashville around and then Amy Grant showed up at the Capitol, and I'm like, I'm so glad that she did. Like, we've been trying to get her and Dolly Parton and a few others to come out on the death penalty, but then I was on a call the other day with Kim Kardashian, and she's speaking about the death penalty, and I'm like, yes, this is beautiful. I've busted on Kim Kardashian from time to time, so I'm going to step back a little, have a little humility and openness. But and Justin Bieber made clothes for my friend Q at who's a pastor on Skid Row. Like, he's raising all this money for him. So I'm like, I think we all need a little humility right now, and I think it's probably lonely sometimes to be like Kim Kardashian or Justin Bieber. So this whole thing that you're identifying, it's not just bad for the fans. I think it's bad for the celebrities. And so I'm so glad that you're helping us get after it and figure how we can be more faithful to Jesus. So one of my friends who is a musician, he's actually lived here with us for a while. So to me, he's just a friend, but he's Aaron Weiss, and he was a part of a band, Me Without You. And he really struggled with everything we're talking about. In fact, and he ended up singing at Katie and I's wedding, and he's still a really close friend of mine, and he's no longer like touring. And I think some of that was just, he always had this kind of challenge, but he taught me this prayer, and I thought it was great to close this with. Katelyn is, because in a lot of ways he did have a lot of fans, and yet he was really grounded in community. He has real friends too, and I'm honored to be one of those. But he said, there's this prayer, I don't know where he learned it, but he said, "Dear God, forgive me for thinking too highly of myself. Dear God, forgive me for thinking too lowly of myself. Dear God, forgive me for thinking of myself so much."
Yep.
That's kind of what, let's move on beyond ourselves, but like know that we are loved, but know that we are here for something bigger than ourselves. So y'all, what a great hour together. Thank you, Katelyn. And thank you everybody for listening. For those of you on Zoom, you can hang out just for a minute if you want to say hi to Katelyn. Everybody else, we'll see you soon.